Hey, Margie here. There's so much confusion when it comes to how we can use bioidentical hormones and estrogen to help us have strong, healthy bones throughout our life. And on my recent summit, Dr. Felice Gersh gave a fabulous talk on bioidentical hormones. But there were a lot of questions that people asked afterward. So I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to bring Dr. Gersh back and answer your questions. So that's what we're going to do on today's episode. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Felice Gersh. She's a multi-award winning physician with dual board certifications in OB-GYN and integrative medicine. She is the founder and director of the Integrative Medical Group of Irvine, a practice that provides comprehensive healthcare for women by combining the best evidence-based therapies from conventional, naturopathic, and holistic medicine. She taught obstetrics and gynecology at Keck USC School of Medicine for 12 years as an assistant clinical professor, where she received the highly coveted Outstanding Volunteer Clinical Faculty Award. And she now serves as an affiliate faculty member at the Fellowship in Integrative Medicine through the University of Arizona School of Medicine. Dr. Gersh is the best-selling author of PCOS SOS and the PCOS SOS Fertility Fast Track. And her newest book, Menopause 50 Things You Need to Know, is available on Amazon. She's also had numerous scientific articles published in peer-reviewed medical journals. She's a prolific lecturer and has been featured in several films and documentary series. And she's my go-to when it comes to anything about bioidentical hormones and estrogen. And today is filled with great information that I'm really excited she's going to share with all of you. So stay tuned. Welcome, Dr. Gersh. I am so happy to have you here. And it always just makes me happy being with you, but you are just a wealth of knowledge. And this topic on bioidentical hormones and estrogen has been I've been getting so many questions. I had this Q&A recently and I had a whole list of questions. And I said, you know what? I am not the expert on this. That's why I reached out to you. Can you come back on the podcast? Let's clear this up for people because there's just so much confusion and it doesn't have to be that way. So thank you so much for joining me.
Well, it's always fun to be here with you. And yet, I looked at the questions, and clearly there is such a need for more information on this topic.
Absolutely. It's just something that's just not out there. That's the problem. People think that they think that it's not a big deal and there's not that much that they need to know, but it's just the opposite. You have to be knowledgeable. And unfortunately, you have to do your own research. I think that's the way medicine is today, which I think is good. It's not like it used to be where you just go to the doctor and whatever they say is the way it is. You have to have the understanding so you can be knowledgeable and you can choose and figure out the best plan for yourself. So happy you're here.
Well, and it's true that people ultimately have to take responsibility for their healthcare choices, and everything is evolving. I mean, anyone who's been in practice as long as I have has seen transformation in protocols, in recommendations. So, what worked maybe or what seemed to work 20 years ago, that may no longer be applicable today. So, you got to always stay up with the times.
Absolutely. And the other thing I just want to say for everybody listening, what Dr. Gersh is going to talk about is general information. It's not meant to replace consultation with your physician or healthcare provider. She's not providing medical advice to you, just giving us all information so we can make informed choices and figure out how we can utilize this in our lives. So, on that note, I'm just going to start going through the big questions that were asked. So, let's just start with a lot of people were asking, well, because they're thinking about their bones and they're thinking about bioidenticals, which you gave such an on the summit and on other podcasts, you've really talked about the myths that it is safe, and we'll get into that afterwards. But how do we use them in terms of a bone rebuilding plan? Is it more that we're using them? Why don't you talk about how we use them in prevention and how they can be used to help our bones really throughout the life cycle?
Well, it turns out, and I always talk about this, that fertility is the prime directive of life. Now, fortunately, we do have options so that we don't have to have babies when we don't want them and so on. But understanding that the female body is designed for successful reproduction, and that involves coordinating all of the organ systems, including the musculoskeletal system. And most people do realize this because it just was the one organ system that got sort of a little bit of attention, that when you lose your hormones with the onset of menopause, which is really about ovarian aging, that you lose a lot of issues in terms of vaginal health. You have vaginal dryness, you can get night sweats, hot flashes, and you get loss of bone. You get the onset of the development osteoporosis. Well, it's not just bone. Of course, it's every organ system that is impacted because it's one body. It's sort of, you could say, sinks or swims together. And the hormone that comes from the ovaries, the estrogen that's called estradiol, has a letter and a number E2, that particular hormone made by the ovaries during the reproductive years has function receptors in every organ system, including the bones, but every other organ system, the cardiovascular, the neurological, the immune system, the skin, like you name it, there's hormone receptors for estradiol. And it's for the purpose of having an overall healthy body, because becoming pregnant and being pregnant and caring for babies requires a healthy body. So when you lose your ability to be fertile and reproductive and the ovaries age out and stop making estradiol, every organ system takes a hit. Now, fortunately, we are very resilient and we don't just go off the cliff in most cases. It's sort of a downward trend, like you're going down the hill and, towards the chronic degenerative diseases that are attributed to aging. But I attribute them to deficiencies. And it starts with the number one deficiency of estradiol. So understanding that every organ system is interconnected and that the hormonal glue is actually estradiol. So I call it not a sex hormone. I call it a life hormone because it really does provide the basis for fertility, reproductive health, and overall systems health, or what we call metabolic homeostasis. And metabolism is the production, utilization, distribution, storage of energy. So if we look at bones from the very beginning of, we'll say, puberty, okay, bones get into the action involving estradiol. So actually, it's very critical during the early years of bone development to have adequate amounts of estradiol. So that would be during the years right after you have your first period. So typically it's the mid to late teens and then the first 5 or so years of the 20s. That's when you build the most bone. And it's so critical to have optimal nutrition, optimal hormones, optimal fitness so that you achieve the highest, healthiest density of bone that you can possibly have. And then you build a little bit more bone and it completely ends, in the very early 30s, around age 30. And that's when you do a bone density, they're comparing your bones with what's called the T score of the bone density when you do a DEXA scan to the optimal, healthiest of times when you would have bone, and that would be in the very early 30s. So that's like you're being compared on the T score, just so you understand, because every one of you out there, I'm sure, has had a DEXA scan. Like, what is that? What is a joke? You're comparing to this sort of somewhat hypothetical, perfect bone woman back around age 30, 32. So having optimal nutrition, adequate nutrients, micronutrients, macronutrients, and having these wonderful hormones to build bone. And of course, estradiol, I said, is like the leader of the pack, but you need all the right hormones. You can't just have, just estradiol. You have to have the right amounts of everything. You don't want to have chronic stress, too much cortisol. You want to have the right thyroid. You want to have everything right, right? Because that's set the scene for optimal bone development. Then the next decades of your life, you want to do everything to maintain optimal bone. And then starting with the perimenopause, And this is like, when does it start? It's like the decade before the end of cycles. And remember that menopause is an arbitrary definition. They're making this what is really ovarian aging and loss of production of hormones and the rhythms of the hormones, the menstrual cycle, that is declining as ovarian aging occurs. And they define menopause based on periods. Well, remember, some women have a hysterectomy. They can't go by that definition. The official definition being 12 consecutive months without any bleeding. I can't say a period because we don't know what that bleeding is. Just 12 consecutive months and there's no bleeding. And then you're officially labeled you're in menopause. And then you're in menopause for the rest of your life. But recognizing that it's a process, that it's a process of ovarian aging and changing in the production of estradiol and progesterone too. But we're not going to talk too much about that one. Maybe another time we'll talk and focus on progesterone. But if you think of it as it's going down and you get sometimes spikes up, but it's always going down and spikes up. So as your estradiol production is declining during the years preceding the end of cycles, the official menopause, you are losing bone density, and it can actually be quite significant. And this is completely ignored by the medical world. But it's just ignored. I mean, and there are things that you can do. So understanding the foundations of osteoporosis really requires understanding the the things that happen preceding osteoporosis, bone development, bone maintenance, and the importance of adequate nutrition and fitness and hormones. And then that the bone loss is actually quite significant during the pre or perimenopausal years, which could be like, you could say, a decade before the actual official menopause, if you have a uterus, or whenever we decide it is if you don't have a uterus. And it's really when your ovaries are not creating cycles anymore. You're not ovulating. You still make a little bit of estrogen after so-called official menopause, but you're not ovulating, so you don't have the periods. And then the rest of your life, when you're in menopause, you will definitely continue to lose bone. But the first 5 years, there can be very accelerated bone loss. So you can lose a lot of bone while you're evolving and your estrogen production is declining. But then when you really end up with a very low state of estradiol and you're officially in menopause, those first 5 years after that point, you can have very accelerated bone loss, and it can be, really dramatic. And here's the real truth. Okay. We don't know how to put it back exactly as it was at its peak. So we do the best we can. So when we talk about giving estradiol, my personal opinion now wasn't always that way because, like I said, evolving thoughts, right, is that we should think about everything. The hormones, maybe adding what I would call supplemental estradiol during the perimenopausal years. And then, of course, it's hormone replacement because then you're not making any. So first it's supplementation, then it's replacement. And you can think about it like this. If someone had low thyroid, okay, but their thyroid is still working, they have a thyroid, but it's not working adequately. So they don't make enough thyroid hormone, but they do make some thyroid hormone. They'll put someone on thyroid supplementation, levothyroxine. Okay, but if someone has a problem and their whole thyroid gland is removed and they have no thyroid hormone being produced, then they'll be on total replacement, right? So think of it as supplementation with estradiol when the estrogen levels are too low, just like people have hypothyroid, and then complete replacement when there's no ovarian production any longer. And that's how I think now is the best approach to maintaining bone. Because once you're well into a really severe state of osteoporosis, we're really trying to hold our own and maybe a little bit of building, but we can't turn the clock back. And that's true with every late stage disease. So my strength is in prevention and maintenance, not in like completely global repair. Like I can't fix someone with end stage renal failure or heart failure, or end stage dementia from any cause. And I can't really repair really severe osteoporotic bones, but we can try to hold our own and do a little bit of building and we can always work with all the tools we have to prevent fractures because ultimately that's what we want to avoid, right? Um, we're not treating a bone density report, we're treating a person. So I just wanted to have a chance because there were so many questions to just give this sort of foundational information because you can't really talk about therapeutic modalities if you don't have sort of a foundation of what is happening. And then, okay, now let's look at what can we actually do to optimize bone at every stage of life.
Oh, I love everything you said, and I just have a few questions. And something you taught me way back was and you mentioned about, children and teens, that a lot of times birth control and things that people are taking could impact bone later on. You wanna just quickly mention that? Because it's something that's
Wow.
not talked about.
I know, and it is what it is. If you have a female who has a, like, say, anorexia nervosa, and so she's not making any estradiol, in those specific cases, and hopefully we can fix, the eating disorder, giving exogenous hormones, and that would include birth control pills, so that would actually be my personal choice, but that's the conventional approach. I would rather give human bioidentical hormones in that situation while we're working on healing the emotions and the eating issues. But that's probably, in my opinion, the only place where there can be any place for giving hormonal contraceptives to try to have some beneficial impact on bones. Because if you use hormonal contraceptives in the typical way for contraception, or now they're being used off label and sometimes on label for all kinds of other things like acne, menstrual cycle irregularities, and menstrual cramps, and even, PMS and a lot of, heavy periods and so on. If they're used either on or off label, there is an impact on a variety of things, and including the bones. So there was one research that was it's very limited research on this, by the way, but when there was a study that was done looking at several different doses of birth control pills. And this was a European study. And what they showed was that the birth control pills, and these were using women with having regular cycles. So, we're limited in our data because people are not like looking for the answers. I wish that they were, but we have science. We have science that we know. But if they're looking at the data, they took women who had they were young, they're like teens, who had regular cycles, and what they did was they gave them a very low estrogen. Now, the estrogen that we're talking about is ethinyl estradiol. So it's not a human made estrogen. It's a man created product. It doesn't exist in nature. It doesn't exist in any living creature naturally, including humans. It's a manufactured chemical, which technically has a label of endocrine disruptor. An endocrine disruptor is any chemical compound that interferes with any aspect of the endocrine hormone. It could be the production, the distribution, the receptor function, the utilization, the degradation, the elimination, like anything that has to do with how a hormone gets into a body, gets out of a body, or functions in a body is an endocrine disruptor. And you have to remember the whole purpose of birth control pills was to disrupt normal hormones, disrupt normal cycles to prevent fertility. And now we know, which we did not know when birth control pills were first evolved and developed and produced and sold, we did not know that these hormones are not just sex hormones, not just reproductive hormones, but also life hormones, that they have a function in every organ system. They didn't know that, but we know that now, including the musculoskeletal system, which includes the ligaments, the tendons, the cartilage, the muscle, and the bone. All of those aspects, every aspect of the musculoskeletal system is related to estrogen. That is estrogen produced in the female body from the ovaries. And when you put in this, we'll say, pretend or mimic of estradiol called ethinyl estradiol, what they found in the study was when they used the very lowest dose, what they call, estrogen containing birth control pills. And then they used like sort of a standard low dose. So there's like ultra low, standard low. And then they compared it to matched young women who were not on birth control pills at all. And this was all using birth control pills, and they were having their natural cycles. It's what you might guess, knowing what I talk about, right? The women who had the natural cycles built the most bone. The women who were on the sort of standard low dose, because nobody uses high dose birth control pills, that were on the standard, what they call low dose, which is comparing to the original birth control pill. So they call standard low dose. They built bone, but less than the women who had the natural cycles. And the women who were on the ultra low dose of ethinyl estradiol in their birth control pills, they didn't build hardly any bone. I mean, it was like, wow, their bone growth was really nominal. So to me, I mean, it was a limited study. It didn't go on for a decade, right? But that is to me a red flag. We'll just call it a red flag study that, hey, maybe it's really important that we have natural cycles, especially during the peak bone growing years, which are the teens, like once the periods have started through at least the first half or 2/3 of the 20s. I just say, please, I mean, of course, these are the years when women and, young women are typically on hormonal contraceptives. We do have lots of data on the shot, the Depo-Provera shot, which not too many people are using, but yet I still see people coming in who are on it or have been given it. Those shut down all the estradiol production from the ovaries, or pretty close to all. And then in those women, they have definitely very poor, this has been written up a lot, they have poor bone development. And it was thought at one point, well, when you stop it, which hopefully you do, but who knows? Like I see people on contraceptives for 30 years straight now. But when you so-called stop it, then your bone will just all catch up. Well, guess what? It doesn't actually work that way. We know that. So it's just what it is. Don't kill the messenger. I can't tell. This is how female humans evolve. No one anticipated during evolution that we would be trying to stop procreation, because no other animal on this planet is intentionally trying to change their fertility status or their ability to have babies any particular year, just us humans. And it just is, unfortunately, that the systems in our body are designed to optimize during the developmental years of our lives, which go up into the late 20s. Like we're not like finished being cooked, so to speak, until we're like into our latter 20s. And we know this, and there have been published studies on cardiovascular health. And we know, like I said, it's a complete interconnected web of all the organ systems. There have been published articles now that women who start birth control pills in their teens have a higher risk for their lifetime of cardiovascular disease and events. So, I mean, it is what it is. That's been published. And I think that that would hold true for into the 20s, but we don't have that data because 90% of women are hormonal contraceptive. You can't get a control group, right? You can't like, who's the control group? Like they're all on something, right? So here's the thing, but we know in the teens that it's bad long term for the lifetime of that individual for their cardiovascular system. And we know from so much data, what's bad for your heart is bad for your brain. It's bad for your bones. It's, it just works that way. It's not like something that's terrible for your heart is like incredibly good for your bones. It doesn't work that way. So, this is like a big clue. That's why in menopause, they have all these really strange studies. I call them stranges because to me, they're all like, duh, like, how could that be? You didn't know that? Like women who have more osteoporosis are more prone to dementia. By the way, that was published, right? Because the brain and the bones are linked and they'll have the same thing. Women who have more cardiovascular disease tend to have more, vaginal prolapse. I mean, it's like, okay, it's all, different people manifest differently with deficiency states. So everyone doesn't have like their prime organ system that goes awry, we'll say, but they're all interconnected. And so that's why the chronic diseases of aging often will occur all in the same person, but with more maybe emphasis of one organ system than another in any one individual. So getting back to it, like I wish that we had better contraceptive alternatives, but you can't make change if you don't at least acknowledge that there's an issue. So I always say the first step in solving a problem is at least to recognize the problem. So I'm not saying that no one should ever use birth control and everyone should have unwanted baby at every stage in any stage of life. I'm just saying we need to be honest that when these contraceptives were developed, no one knew what we know now. So we shouldn't be ignoring this. This is not insignificant, and we'll never get better alternatives if we're not honest about what we're doing. And even if bones were out of the picture, which they're not, we have published data for sure. We have published data on bones and we have published data on cardiovascular. So let's be honest and let's, start talking, open the dialogue. So we need to keep looking for better options.
Oh, I love that answer. And I think for everybody listening, children, grandchildren, this is important information that's just not really out there and not talked about. And we're not going to know the ramifications till many years later, when we all of a sudden see bone health is really changing from all these people who've been on contraception, different things. It's just not something that's out there. So I think it's important to spread that information. I think the other really important thing you talked about, Dr. Gersh, that is an opportunity. Just like you said, this can prevent bone loss and keep our bones healthy. And so just how you said to use it in perimenopause when you're starting to, when you don't have the same amount of estrogen, that's where you supplement. So it starts early on. It's not wait until you've lost all this bone and then
Yes.
think about it. It's a missed opportunity that is available. And I really do think now more gynecologists and more people are realizing it's not dangerous. And you did such a beautiful talk about why it's not dangerous as we used to think. That this is just an opportunity early on to prevent bone loss and really make a difference in the trajectory of osteoporosis. Because if we can start with our kids, our teens, perimenopause as they get older, it's going to be very different. So that was really helpful. But what I want to talk about, and this is where there's so much confusion, because you said it really prevents, the estrogen isn't going to give us massive amount of
Yeah.
new bone formation. And so we want to know, and I got a lot of questions after the summit because there are a lot of people who have DEXA tests, very, very low bone density, like -4 or minus, when they do the DEXA test and they've had fractures. So something's going on. So who is it a candidate for? Well, I guess there's 2 questions in here. We'll get to that question in a second, actually. But a lot of people have asked, let's go back to the safety. So here is one question someone said, and this is someone who came to the summit. She loved your talk, and she's 67, has never taken estrogen. I got a lot of questions like this. Are there any identified risks of heart attack or stroke from taking estradiol after 16 years of menopause? I would say I got 10 questions similar to this. People haven't taken it. They're now, way beyond menopause for many years. Who would it be the right candidate for? And if
Well,
it's safe.
this is definitely a problem. We have lots of science and very few clinical studies. So if we look at safety data, and that's really predominantly all I have, and I don't have even a lot of studies on that, but we have observational studies that look at using hormones in older women. And those are when you use transdermal estrogen, not the conjugated equine estrogens, and even more importantly, the medroxyprogesterone acetate, the mimic for progesterone, which is often tossed around using the word progesterone when it's an endocrine disruptor for progesterone. It's not the real thing. I call these things like the evil clones. They're not real. They're like evil mimics or like the evil twin that they masquerade as if they're the real thing, but they are not. And unfortunately, a lot of times, even in medical literature, they refer to them as if they are the real thing when they're not. And so, but when you look at those chemical compounds, the conjugated equine estrogens, long term, or giving them to women who are in, like, say, over 65, and they haven't been on hormones ever, and now they're to put them on those chemical compounds, medroxyprogesterone acetate and conjugated equine estrogens, which were the compounds used in the Women's Health Initiative, which occurred over 20 years now. It's like amazing. In that scenario, it did show that if you started these hormone compounds And I wish that they wouldn't even be called hormones. I wish the word hormone would only be used for hormonal, like these endocrine created chemicals that are made in a living being, okay, as opposed to something that doesn't exist in nature at all. I wish they would not call them hormones because it's so confusing to people because they mix and match like they're all the same and it's totally different. And it's really frustrating. It would be like using the word trans fat um, or using trans fat in foods and then saying fats are bad because all you're using is trans fat, which we know is very bad, so it's really a problem. The words matter and they're really confusing things. But when you use, we'll say the wrong hormones, okay, the ones from the Women's Health Initiative, and you start them in older women, that is not a good idea. I do not recommend that ever because the compounds increase risk of bad outcomes in that age group. The conjugated equine estrogens, for example, increase the risk of spontaneous blood clotting and in women who already have an increased risk because age is the biggest factor for developing things like blood clots in your legs, blood clots in your lungs, blood clots in your arteries. Okay. Aging is the biggest factor. But of course, I look at aging as deficiencies, but these people have deficiencies. So aging. So you don't want to give the conjugated equine estrogen because it increases the risk of spontaneous blood clots 400%, fourfold increase. So if you give it to someone who already has vascular disease and then they are prone to they're in an inflammatory state. They call it like inflammaging. The aging related inflammation. And the arteries have inflammatory, unstable plaque in them because there's vascular disease already in play, which was the case in these studies. Then you add in this chemical that increases spontaneous blood clotting, and then you have ruptured plaque, and then you make a clot that forms on where the plaque ruptured into where the inside of the artery is where the blood is flowing and that clot falls off and travels downstream, it'll create a blockage like a boulder in a river and it blocks the flow of blood. So everything downstream will no longer be able to get adequate oxygen. And that's what is a stroke when it's in the brain. It's a heart attack. It could be in the intestines and you could have ischemic bowel. So you could have it in the legs, right? So anytime you get an artery that has ruptured plaque, forms a little clot like a scab, it breaks off, goes downstream and clogs up, the flow, then that leads to the equivalent of a heart attack. It just depends on which organ, okay? And that is more like going to happen if you start that type of hormonal compound in an older woman who already has all these pre-existing issues. So I cannot recommend that ever, ever, ever. But what
Wait,
if you
excuse me, does anyone still do you see that this is still prescribed?
oh my
Those
goodness, yes.
Oh,
It's still very, very prevalent. And there are even some newer drugs out there that incorporate Premarin. I shouldn't say Premarin, like conjugated equine estrogens. That was just the brand name that they used. Conjugated equine estrogens with other what they call SERM, selective estrogen receptor modulators. There's actually products that combine them. So yes, these are being used, and they're being used and being trained into the curriculum of a lot of like nurse practitioners and PAs and doctors. They're still prescribing these, okay? They're still on formulators. It's not off the market. It's still available. So yes, it's still being prescribed and medroxyprogesterone acetate still exists. You can still prescribe that. 100%. Yes, these are not they were not taken off the market. So all they got was a black box warning, but the black box warning went on every hormone product. That's the problem. It's like the good twin got tainted with the reputation of the bad twin. And that's what I speak about, so that people don't get these mixed messages or like incorrect messages because you're talking about a totally different item. It's like trans fat is evil, but omega-3 from a wild salmon is good for you, So it's like we got to talk the right language and make sure we know what we're talking about here. But in the one study that actually showed safety was the ELITE study from a few years ago. where they took women who were further out and older and they put them on hormones. It was still the wrong type. It was an oral estradiol, but even so, so they still didn't do things right. But in that study, because they didn't use conjugated equine estrogen, in that study, they showed no harm after a few years on these hormonal products. But it was still not the right thing. It was not the transdermal estradiol. But there are many observational studies from Europe that show tremendous safety even in older women, but we don't have double-blinded prospective placebo-controlled trials that go out using transdermal estrogen in women in their late 60s and 70s. So I have to be honest, I want there to be studies, but I don't have them. But so here's the thing. You can look at science. So this is my take on it of observational and just my, like I call it, my thinking brain. Okay. So I want to make this clear. These are my thoughts. Okay. And my thoughts alone. Okay. If you give, and this is actually promoted like crazy in the medical organizations that deal with menopausal women, if you give women at any age, like they could be 70s, 80s, doesn't matter how far out they are in their menopause journey, you can give them vaginal estrogen. You can give them vaginal estrogen. And this is heavily promoted for what's now called genitourinary syndrome of the menopause. We used to call it vaginal atrophy, and now it's genitourinary syndrome of the menopause. And so that incorporates the bladder because the bladder is often problematic, with repeated urinary tract infections, bladder infections, urgency, incontinence, different types, and vaginal atrophy, drying, painful intercourse, and then the associated other things, with prolapse, pelvic organ prolapse, everything's falling down, cystoceles, rectoceles, because of loss of proper health of the fascia, the connective tissue that keeps things in place. So they call it now genitourinary syndrome of the menopause, and they promote heavily vaginal, intravaginal estrogen. And there's creams and tablets and rings, a variety of products at any age. And guess what happens when you do that? There's improvement. Shocker alert. It helps at any age. So why would I think, knowing the science of the body, why would I think that only the vagina can improve? That's the only structure, or the bladder, just the vagina and the bladder. Just like after menopause, the only organ system that's impacted is the bones and the vagina. Like, no, okay? It's everything. So if you can help restore to some degree, it's not like you're going to turn the vagina of a 70-year-old woman into one of a 20-year-old. That's not happening. We're not turning back the clock. We're just doing better, okay? My goal is better, okay? Best is a dream, but we go better. So if you can improve the health status of the vagina and the bladder by giving vaginal estrogen at any stage of life, no matter how far along you are in the menopausal years, why would that not apply to every other organ system? It just seems illogical to me, but I don't have proof. But we do have other people who believe like me. I'm not the only one, like Dale Bredesen, who does, Alzheimer's work. He recommends estrogen in the form of the patch or a transdermal estrogen, not the pill, not the oral versions. He recommends transdermal estradiol for all of his women that are, his patients or other people's patients when he has a protocol, to help with brain health, the immune system of the brain, the neurons of the brain, the whole structure, the vascular system to the brain. All of these things can improve, in his opinion, from what my knowledge is of his work. So I don't want to put words in his mouth. So this is all my opinions and my interpretation of what he has accomplished and is still accomplishing, that adding in estradiol in a topical version is really good for the brain. And like I said, what's good for the brain is good for the bones. To me, what's good for the vagina is good for, everything. Okay, so that's my take on it. So the official approach is not to give hormones to women who are older based on the Women's Health Initiative data. That's it. To me, that's a totally appropriate thing to say. Don't give what they used in the Women's Health Initiative to women, really, my opinion, at any age, but particularly once they're over 60. But I wouldn't want it at any age. But definitely not over 60 or further out into the menopausal years if they had a very early menopause. So I'm agreeing with that, but I'm saying, why are you painting everything with the same brush? Because they're different products. So we need to distinguish between the different products that are marketed, and we have to look at the science more than sometimes the published peer-reviewed studies, which are very limited. So I know that's a long answer because this is a huge question. It comes up so much because so many of these women who, like you mentioned, they're in their 60s and 70s, they went through menopause during the heyday of hate of hormones, when hormones were anathema. You would never give hormones. Hormones are so evil. So they were told, don't take hormones. It was so blunt. Don't take hormones. They're bad for you. And so they lost out on that, what is now called, it's labeled the window of opportunity. They lost out on the critical time in their lives when things were going south and they had the best opportunity for prevention. Okay. Now we're past prevention into trying to alleviate further progression and harm and maybe a little bit of improvement. And I don't want them to lose that opportunity either, because this is it. You can't wait for the studies. It is what it is. There's nothing happening. So it's like, well, I'll just wait for that study. What study? You have to make decisions based on the evidence and the data that we have, which is limited, but it is what it is. So I look at it this way. You're living in the past, like you're living 10,000 years ago, and you're walking through the forest, and there's no road signs, there's no Google Maps, okay? And you're like sort of on a very primitive path, and you know sort of where you want to go, but you're not sure how to get there. And you get to sort of a fork in this primitive path, and you don't know if you should go right or left. So, what are your options? No one's going to come and save you, okay? No one's going to give you Google Maps. You just have to make a decision. You either you look at the lay of the land, you look at the evidence you have, you look at where the sun is in the sky and where's the sun going to set, east, west, and so on. You look at, the tracks from the wild animals, and you either sit there and hope for the best, or you make a right turn or a left turn because you got to make a decision. So every woman who is in her 60s and 70s, even older, like, you're alive, but you're over 60. Um, you have to make a decision. You could do nothing. You could make a positive, action and try hormones. You have to make a decision. It's not illegal to go on hormones at any stage of life. I'm not promoting illegal behavior here, but it's important to know we don't have great studies. We have science, we have other people, we have some data, we have medicine, and we have alternatives. So you have to look at the alternatives. And in every decision in medicine, it always comes down to the critical risk benefit ratio. What's the risk? What's the potential benefit? And each individual has to look at it for herself. So that's why I'm not giving personalized advice here, because I don't know you, whoever you are that's listening, right? But you have to look at your personal goals, your personal situation, and look at the options and then decide for yourself based on like the whole idea, you're walking in a forest and there's no one that's going to come and give you for sure the directions. You have to kind of make your own path in life and decide what you're going to do and try to make the best decision for you based on what data we do have available. So in my own personal practice, looking at each individual woman patient's goals, history, medical status, in some cases, I will prescribe hormones to older women with the understanding of everything I said. It's a fully informed decision based on all the options and looking at her personal goals and health status. And so far, so good.
Yeah, no, that's great. We could talk forever, but I do have a couple of questions before we end. I just want to run by you. So, what you had said is maybe it might build a little, but it's really to hold on to what you have. So, someone who has already fractured, lost bone, this wouldn't be what you would suggest. Is that what I'm hearing? That you can't look at this as okay, they're a very very high risk for fracture. This would be your first choice. Does that make sense?
Okay, I lost you there for like the
Ok
last 2
oh,
minutes.
okay, my question is someone who really has fractures, they've had multiple fractures, they have -4, that's not the place for the estrogen. Is that correct? Because it's
Well, it wouldn't be in that case,
okay,
it would be a solo, okay?
exactly. Okay, that I just
I
wanted
would
to clear that up. Okay.
yeah, so in someone like that, they would probably benefit, this is a general statement,
Yeah,
from, drugs that build bone as opposed
exactly.
to
So
just prevent resorption of bone, and I don't see it as a contraindication, also recognizing we have no data, to add a little bit of estrogen along for the ride, but, that's not commonplace. That is not
well, I
standard.
wanted to yeah, my goal was
Right.
that there are
Thank God.
people listening who, have very low bone density, and
Yeah.
I was wanted to get your take on where estrogen fits in. So my next question is, before we end, I just wanna tell people how to do it safely because unfortunately, there are a lot of people giving pellets. There are a lot of people doing all sorts of things, and it really matters who you go to, how this is done for it to be effective and safe. Is that what do you agree, Dr. Gersh, with that?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, there's a sort of a proliferation of telemedicine companies and clinics that are not manned by people who really understand hormones. I hate to say it, it's sort of just a business enterprise, often owned and started by business people as opposed to medical professionals, and they really don't know what they're doing. I mean, they're just giving out hormones, and maybe if you have no other options, that's something. But that's to me like low choice, low on the totem pole, because you have to finesse it. This is really the art of medicine. Every individual needs to be looked at totally uniquely. When we give transdermal estradiol, you don't know how much is gonna be absorbed by any one person. So you've gotta look at levels, you've gotta try different doses because the skin is how we're delivering the hormones. Well, typically with transdermal going through the skin, well, the skin is technically a barrier. You're not really supposed to give medicine or hormones through the skin. It's just amazing that we've had ways to adapt to, formulations and creams and patches and things that we can actually get it through the skin, but it's not the same in different women. So you can give the same dose of estradiol in the same format through the skin and get totally different levels in every woman that you give it to. And also, it doesn't mean that you have the same level every day if you're using, say, a patch, because the patch is going to be depleted as the days go by. So you really have to monitor this. And if you have a uterus, there is a potential that you're going to have bleeding. And in fact, I prefer to create predictable bleeding in my patients by giving pulsed progesterone, real progesterone, for 2 weeks out of each month, because that's more in alignment with the way the female body is designed to work. And the progesterone that's given actually has an impact on the receptor function of the estradiol. It downregulates it. So if you give progesterone every single day, you're actually blocking some of the benefit of the estradiol. And the purpose and the reason that kind of a protocol was developed to try to prevent bleeding, to try to prevent growth of the uterine lining. But the uterus is like a marker. If your uterine lining is growing, so too is other tissues in your body growing. It's just invisibly growing because growth is about repair, replacement, regeneration. So I want that growth of the uterine lining. I don't want to suppress it. I want it to be symbolic of the growth everywhere in the body. So we've got to rethink what is the purpose. And this is really important. When a woman goes on hormone therapy, is the purpose to suppress night sweats and hot flashes? That doesn't take much of anything. And you can give progesterone every day. You can give very tiny doses. If your purpose, and this is not the FDA purpose, except preventing bone loss. That's like, it's so weird what is FDA approved. But the general medical community is not recommending that you give hormone therapy for anything other than suppression of night sweats and hot flashes and vaginal atrophy or, genitourinary syndrome of the menopause, and rarely for bone health, rarely, although that's on the FDA approval for bone health, but rarely is that used. So when I say your goals are important in terms of how you're going to use the hormone, if your goal is, and this is what I believe, but this is not universal, but I want you to be sure and you know that global health, trying to help maintain brain and cardiovascular and skin and bones and muscles and everything. Okay, the gut, all the gut health, everything. If your goal is like healthy aging, we'll say, healthy longevity, then you need to give hormones to get levels that are similar to what would be the healthy levels of a younger woman. And you need to give hormones in something of a similar way that has the rhythm of a menstrual cycle, because that's how we were evolved to be the healthiest. I mean, it's all together. Once you understand fertility and global body health are together, then you have to accept what is that you can have regular so-called it's real blood, but it's not really a period in the sense you're not fertile. But it's really important. I mean, the takeaway is you need someone who knows what they're doing. Okay, you can't just be given hormones and you have your regular bleeding. Who's going to take care of you? Who's going to monitor you? Who's going to finesse it if you don't absorb it well? And you have to try a different system. You have to place the hormones, like you have to go from a patch, you have to go to a gel, or maybe you have to go to compounded, because when you use compounded, that's what gives you more of the freedom to use different concentrations and different locations for placement to find where you're going to absorb it best, because everyone is so unique. So you can't just, uh, you know, get the best care if you just go to some random place that just opens and says, we're doing hormones, and you don't have any credentialed people in terms of what they really know. And they can't deal with any of the side effects or complications like every medication, and this one is unique because we're always kind of N of one. Every unique person has to be dealt with for, the unique person that she is and her goals and her absorption and her changing status and so forth. And what she wants, if a woman says to me, I want hormones, but I absolutely cannot have any bleeding, I'm not, then okay, I have to just compromise. But you need a dialogue for all of this. And unfortunately, I just have to comment on this because I thought this was one of the questions, was on bias. So estriol is what's in bias in large measure, along with usually a smaller amount of estradiol. And that was, that whole idea of using a different estrogen. Remember, estrogen is not a hormone, it's a family of hormones. And the ones that are made by the human body are E1, 2, 3, and 4. Estradiol is the one that's made by the ovaries, and that has the designation E2. It also is in equilibrium with the other estrogens in the body, but that's the dominant one made by the ovaries. Estriol is the dominant estrogen made by the placenta in pregnancy, and it's derived from estradiol. But it has a different effect on the receptors. So there's different receptors, and estradiol has the balance effect on all. Estriol works predominantly on just one receptor called the beta. And in the bones, it's more alpha. That's why when you give conjugated equine estrogens, which goes into the body predominantly as E1, estrone, that affects predominantly one receptor, which is unfortunately the receptor that's typically positive on breast cancer, but doesn't cause breast cancer, but it can promote the growth if you already develop breast cancer. And that's estrone. That's coming from oral estrogens predominantly, and inflamed people when they make their own estrogen in fat, another topic for another day. But also, it works on bone. So E1, that's why when you give oral estrogen, it does help bone, but it's not the same for other organs. I mean, you want the balance. That's why you want the hormone that the body was designed to have coming from the ovary, which is estradiol. So estriol is not going to be as beneficial for a variety of organs. And it also we now know that if you have a lot of dominant effect on the beta receptor, it downregulates or makes less effective the functioning of the alpha receptor, which is then going to sort of negate some of the benefits of the other circulating estrogens on the bone. So I don't recommend that you use biased, especially if your goal is bone health. But I don't recommend it for anything because it's not natural in any sense. There's no stage of a woman's life when she would have hormones like that. Even in pregnancy, she doesn't have hormones like you're getting that are anything like what you're getting when you get a prescription for bias. So I'm a very simple thinker. Give the body what it was designed to have. Don't try to create a new universe because that didn't work out with food and processed food either. So let's just give what the body made, since we have such clever people who can actually create identical hormone to what the ovaries were making, give it in a reasonable amount to the tolerance of the woman and based on her own desires. And if possible, start early during the perimenopausal years. And if you're older and you already have serious bone loss, recognize that I wish that this were the case, but giving hormones at that stage is not going to put the bones back the way they were. It doesn't have that power. It might help some to stabilize, but it's not going to rebuild large amounts of bone. It can't do that. And we can't give mega doses in older women. We have no data. So we just have to be realistic about what we can and can't do.
Well, that was a great sum up, Dr. Felice. And I had an idea. I'm going to be doing some like really quick YouTube. So maybe some of the other questions you and I can get together and just do, a 5-minute YouTube on some of the other questions
Oh,
because we could talk for hours
great.
and this is such an important topic. But I think you really put it in a nutshell. Estradiol patch, make sure you work with someone who's doing blood work and really, checking your values and is available to you. So for people who live in California, you're very lucky because you can tell us how people can work with you though,
Oh,
because,
well,
you are, I've had patients who have seen you and, you're just amazing. So why don't you share how people can work with you before we end?
sure. Well, I'm a conventional doctor in the sense I actually have a brick and mortar practice. I'm actually speaking to you. Behind that screen is an exam table. And so, yes, I'm in my office right now and I see patients every day, Monday through Friday. So in California, the way the laws work, I don't have to ever see anyone in person, but I love seeing people in person, but I don't have to. If you're in another state, I do have to see you once or twice a year. And then, of course, if there's some real problem, then that could also require a visit. But fortunately, I'm in Southern California, Irvine, which is right next to Laguna Beach and Newport Beach, and not far from like 20 minutes, if that, from Disneyland. So I'm right in a mega tourist center where people love to come. So, and we have affordable flights, and not just into my local airport, John Wayne, but into LAX, which is only 45 minutes away. And so people come all the time and they have like a long weekend, they have some fun and they get to see me. And it's actually workable. It sounds crazy, but it is workable to be from another state and still be under my care and do it in a total, perfectly appropriate way. And so I'm here for people and I have a team that works with me, all trained by me. So, I'm here to help. That's my mission in life. And that's why I love being with Margie because she gives me a platform that I can help to spread the word and help women to make informed decisions about their health.
And you do such a good job of that. And just tell everybody about your Instagram because that's really great as well.
Oh, I'm
And
trying.
also,
I didn't do one this week. I'm trying, but I'm trying as often as I can, most weeks, to do an Instagram live. And I try to, stay to a very interesting topic, often one that's maybe in the news. And they're typically, relevant to many different age groups, but I sometimes focus on one area or another. And so please follow me on Instagram live. And I don't know if you put up the link, but it's dr period Felice Gersh, but make sure you put that period in there.
yeah, I'll have everything in the show notes. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to let you get back to work, Dr. Gersh. Thank you so much for spending the time with us and answering questions. And we'll talk about maybe we'll do some short things that we can
That would
post because there were so many questions, but I think you got the
I
gist of
know.
it. You really got what a lot of people want to know. So thank you for joining me.
So,
And it's always
yeah,
wonderful being
that'll
with
be
you.
fun. We can get into more nitty-gritty. I love
Yeah, we'll
it.
just do some little short ones. Okay, thank you so much again. It's always a pleasure. Wow, I love speaking to Dr. Gersh. She's just a wealth of knowledge, and I hope she cleared up some of your estrogen questions. There were so many more questions, and what Dr. Gersh and I decided we're going to do is we're going to answer them one-on-one, one question at a time, and post them on YouTube. So stay tuned for more. And all the links to get in touch with Dr. Gersh as well as her Instagram will be in the show notes. So thank you so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you on future episodes.